Ladies and gentlemen, today's guest is Professor Zaman Stanizai, Professor of Islamic Studies at the Pacifica Graduate Institute and Professor of Political Science at California State University, Dominguez Hills. Welcome to our program, Professor Zaman.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
In today's conversation, I would like to ask you about your experience with Hizmet movement, the Hizmet followers, with Fethullah Gulen. So how did you get to know Hizmet?
Well, it was a wonderful coincidence that I appreciate, and I feel very fortunate that I had the chance to meet people who how do they say, who walk the talk. The problem with most of the Muslim world is there's plenty of talk, there's not much walk. And so I think that's where Hizmet becomes relevant, and I have had the experience of meeting them wherever I can see the trademark of service in their behavior.
Thank you for that. At what year did you first meet with them?
It was back probably in 2009. It could have been a year before or after.
I see. With your experience in the Islamic world and with your national background with Afghanistan and the Middle East, you know the Islamic world very well. So how do you see the distinctive features of Hizmet other than practicing what they say, other characteristics of Hizmet? How do you define them?
I think that the Muslim world is in the doldrums these days, unfortunately. And I think out of the 50 poorest country in the world, 23 of them are Muslim, or the so-called Muslim majority countries. And that speaks tons for what Islam used to be and what it has become. And so I think the main problem is the hypocrisy of the states, of governments, and the society in general, where the emphasis is much more on what I usually call the hypocrisy of the mask and the mosque. The mask because of these days, because of the corona. And what that means is that people wear masks to hide their identity. And that's because they are in a psychological bind in terms of what they are and what they ought to be. In other words, between their ideal and where they stand, there is a distance, there is a difference. And so people often want to introduce themselves as what would they like to be or how they would like to be seen rather than what they are. And so obviously that's where the masks come. These are masks that hide your true identity. It's much more important for you to look in a certain way than to be in a certain way. And it's in this context that, because the emphasis is on how to be seen, then Islam becomes, at least in our times, a religion or an identity of manifestation rather than demonstration. And I think in this context, then also the word mosque also comes in, is that more of our piety is a manifested piety. We want to show to people how good we are. We want to show to people how, quote unquote, how Muslims we are, how many titles we carry, the Shaykh and the Al-Hajj and Hajis and so on. The emphasis is on building mosques, but not building schools and hospitals. The emphasis is on let's say even in the month of Ramadan that's upon us, is to show to people how pious we are, rather than acting um, um, to God, so to say, how pious we are. In other words, we are not interested in the action that much, but we are more interested in the in showing people, and so that when it becomes, if the religion, the faith, your identity becomes one of a show, obviously it's the substance that is sacrificed.
So you see the Hizmet followers are practicing what they preach. Do you mean this?
I think that's to me, the way out of where we are in the Muslim world in general, that Hizmet is not just a way. I think Hizmet is the way. Um, uh, from the experience I've had with Hizmet volunteers, is that they do what they say. There is an ayah in the Quran. It says, "Lima taquluna ma la taf'alun." Do not say what you're not doing. I'm slightly paraphrasing it, but that's the idea. That if you should not be saying unless you're doing what you are saying. In other words, there has to be no distance between words and deeds, between words and action. And because this distance that I referred to, because that is a problem, I think among the Hizmet volunteers, they are probably among people who have either shortened the distance between the words and deeds, and I'm sure there are individuals for whom it might have come to as little as zero. It's wonderful to see that kind of willingness, not only just at the individual level, but I think it's more important at the level of humanity, where they just cross the boundaries that have separated us in the names of nations, countries, sectarian differences, whatever difference we humans can find, we will find a justification for drawing a boundary, for creating an otherness, for creating a difference. And when we say difference, it's a difference of superiority. I'm better than you. You're not my worth, and therefore you stay on your side of the line. I think that Hizmet or service becomes meaningful when there are no boundaries, when you are not considering yourself above anyone. If you consider yourself better than someone, obviously you will not be serving them. You will be expecting them to serve you. Mm-hmm. But with the Hizmet volunteers, that's the way they are. You could be talking to an individual who will be so modest, who will be so humble, and you have no idea. But if you had access to the person's bio, and it's like, oh my God, this person is several times more qualified than I am, but look at how much I was bragging, and look at how much he or she was humble. I think it's that humility that manifests the behavior of the Hizmet volunteers in our times.
Yeah, you very well defined some features of Hizmet followers, and this is what I also witness in my life. So these hallmarks, these characteristics actually are coming from the principles that the founder of Hizmet, Fethullah Gulen, put and set up, I can say. So as far as you know, what kind of characteristics, distinctive characteristics of Fethullah Gulen distinguishes him from other leaders?
I think most leaders are, in a way, chauvinists and egoists. They somehow act and behave in a kind of a kind of selfishness. Their ego is driving them. That could be political, for the most part, political leaderships operate that way. And of course, the other thing is that people who follow, in a way, sometimes it's the followers that create the leader. It depends on what do they make of them, of the leader. How do they idealize the leader? How do they create a personality cult around the leader? And I think that there is a kind of two kinds of egos, the ego of a follower and the ego of a leader. In that kind of a dynamic where the whole concept is to deify a leader, to create a god out of a human being and to praise them and all these things. It helps the organization. Most political organizations operate that way. And they create, as I say, a god out of a human being, and then they start worshiping them, and then they start expecting others to do the same. In respect to a spiritual leadership, which is what you're alluding in respect to Fethullah Gulen, is that most of these worldly affairs are irrelevant. A spiritual leader is in search of finding a kind of serenity of the soul within the self. And therefore, the worldly do not matter. And because of that, they operate with a kind of humility which sets a role model. So one of the manifestations of this kind of leadership I've seen is that how effectively can an organization expand beyond the boundaries, and I'm referring to the boundaries I talked about, the the political boundaries, national boundaries, and sectarian boundaries, and all that. I remember when I was in Turkey for a presentation. I was, it was the Hizmet volunteers who were my hosts. So I met them for breakfast in the cafeteria. I think if it was the Fateh University. And I was sitting and they were so wonderful, and we had this nice conversation going on, and I knew that there were a few other tables where there were other guests, and I was expecting most of these to be affiliated with Hizmet, and they were. But then on another table next to us, there were 5, 6 other guests who came and sat around the table, and they brought them breakfast and served them food and all that. And I was just looking at them. They were not speaking a language that I was familiar with. So I asked out of curiosity who they were. And they said, well, these are Cambodians.
Wow.
And I said, but so what are Cambodians doing here? Because my understanding was that this was for all the Muslim states or Muslim societies. And they say, no, that's not the Hizmet policy. They are helping humanity regardless of their faith affiliation, regardless of their religion, regardless of their politics. So they say, yes, Hizmet has schools in Cambodia where there are probably hardly any Muslims. Yeah. And so these are our guests. I was really, in a way, within myself, I found it embarrassing for me to be thinking in terms of a line that I drew in my perception, that they were others and that we were different. And just by telling me that Hizmet operates in something like over 130 countries around the world, and obviously all of them are not Muslim, then I understood how much there was for me to learn. Not from words, but from action on the ground. these examples, and there are also other examples of uh, Hizmet volunteers operating in the trouble spots of the world, in places like Somalia, for example, in places where other volunteers even volunteers of the Médecins Sans Frontières, the Doctors Without Medicine volunteers would sometimes not dare, because to them, of course, like we human beings think instinctively that you have to think of your own survival, of your own safety. And so when a certain area of the world, of this problematic world we live in, when it becomes a little too unsafe, they will withdraw, but not the Hizmet volunteers. And that's why they are sometimes playing with swords, literally. And by swords, I don't mean that they are fighting. By that, I mean they're facing dangers to their own life and to their own survival. But they do not forget that their main objective is to help humanity. If the rest of the world, if most of the world would operate with that kind of a moral compass, with that kind of a universality, with that sense of inclusion, with that sense of respecting people's humanity beyond any other identity, I think the world will be a much, much better place. The problem is that our world, organizationally speaking, our world is way too political, and there's not much room for any kind of spiritual inkling, or for spiritual endeavors, or for spiritual efforts, for people to operate. And of course, the concept of secularism in the West has demonized religion in general so much that they would never think about it. In the Muslim world, there are still some sparks of light here and there. And I think the Gulen movement is one such spark. And I hope that it grows, and I hope it survives the current crisis. And I feel great joy, even though I personally have not become good enough to be a volunteer for the Hizmet, but I take a great joy in seeing them doing for humanity what everyone else ought to be doing.
Thank you. These are great insights for the Hizmet and the principles. As a Sufism expert yourself, and as a poet and expert of Mevlana Celaleddin Rumi, can you draw some parallels between Sufism and the Hizmet hallmarks?
Of Sufis, it's been said that they live in this world, but they are not of this world. And I think that's probably the best axiom that describes Sufism, and in this respect, the Hizmet movement as well, is that we have become too materialistic in this world. Our success is measured by our wealth, by the size of our wallet, by the address we live. And it's all too much of matter that really shouldn't matter. And it's the ideas that are missing, because ideas are stigmatized by labels. If somebody finds a good idea, there are people who will jump at the opportunity and say, look, this is a Muslim idea, we don't want it, or this is a Christian idea, we don't want it. They would reject things, for instance, even things such as democracy, for instance. There are movements in the Muslim world say, we don't want democracy, that's a Christian thing, that's a Western thing. That's, I think, out of total ignorance. So I think if we become less worldly, both in terms of our interest, but also in terms of our preoccupation with material wealth, which uh, can help us survive the best we can. But if that is the survival of the body, our physical survival, it's the joy of the spirit that is missing. And nothing can give you the happiness that you could attain by feeding a hungry person, by saving someone's life, by extending a hand in time of need. You cannot put a price on that because you cannot quantify it. It's the like again, I could throw in a Sufi version of this, is that the Sufis are great, that they're happy, that they're grateful that there are, for instance, beggars and homeless and hungry people. Now, it's not that we want more hungry and homeless people in the world, but it triggers a part of our humanity to tell us that I could be that person in that street corner, that I could be starving and hungry in that particular country. And so therefore, it awakens your consciousness in a way where you feel part of another human. Here, you're not looking for differences, like the one I described earlier, how different we are, how important and how much more significant I am compared to this other person. In this case, none of that matters. Mm-hmm. So whether you're a billionaire or you're the greatest scientist or you're the greatest politician, it doesn't matter. When your hand is stretched out to feed the hungry, you look in the eye of that hungry person and see what is reflected. There is no price in that. Mm-hmm. And so the world is not, there are a lot of inequalities. I think we can make use of our inequalities to find our own shortcomings and try to bring them to a level field of survival, so we can see each other in our humanity rather than our political identities and rather than our religious or other identities. Nothing surpasses humanity. Nothing does. But we have become so tribal in our humanity in modern times, unfortunately, that our humanity is often the last thing that people talk about.
Great. So based on your assessment about the followers and the Hizmet movement, how do you envision the future of Hizmet?
I think there is a kind of resilience woven into the movement. That resilience, I think, I hope, and I pray will pay off at the end, is that I have seen in current times Hizmet volunteers whose entire life's earning has been confiscated. And I'm talking about millions of dollars worth. And you look at that person sitting right across the table from you, and you think that, wait a minute, this person, and probably a few generations before him, must have worked so hard to make so much money, to have such a successful business, to be so useful in a way. In other words, that capital, that operational capital that helped a lot of humanity, that operational capital becomes zero in no time. In other words, it's all gone. I'm sure that if that person was not empowered with the spirit of Hizmet, the person will have a heart attack on the spot. Because that's what, wealth is what defines people. But for wealth for many people is an issue of status, not an issue of service. There's nothing wrong with being rich. What matters is, what do you do with your wealth? You could be like Bill Gates. I think in a certain way, what he does for humanity, that is a hizmet. That's a service to humanity. And you could be some of these other huge, very powerful billionaires who do nothing but spend their money in increasing their wealth more, in creating more distance between themselves and other human beings, and in many cases are involved in political war games, destruction of cities and towns and bombings and all that, through being the source behind the scene of the war machines that operate in the world. That is power too. That is wealth too. But it is used, or rather abused, for the destruction of human life. But the example I give is that, yes, if you have the heart to help, whether you have the power of the pocket, the wallet, the cash, the bank, or you have the power of the pen, the power of knowledge, the power of any other kind of wisdom, whatever power you have. Power is there to be used. But a lot of us are so preoccupied in our competitive sense that we abuse the power, because to most of us, winning is important. And winning is the winning of patting our own ego, or proving to others how much richer and more powerful I am, rather than presenting yourself with all the humility, is that I may or may not be the greatest person on earth, but I want to treat you as the greatest person on the face of earth. I think that is the spirit of Sufism. That's the spirit of Hizmet. Reducing the action between words and deeds.
Great. Thanks so much for all these evaluations and assessment about Hizmet, and your insightful views are really very valuable. Before finalizing, would you like to add anything?
I don't know, but I think I could add a personal experience from my own life. When I was in high school, our high schools in Afghanistan are 6 years. Mm-hmm. From those 6 years, I do remember some of my teachers, not all of them. I do remember a lot of my friends, a lot of my classmates, and the ones with whom I competed and all that. But there's one person I can never forget. In Afghanistan, the condition of the school is kind of mediocre. Our classrooms used to be, swept every morning with brooms. They didn't have anything better than that. And so the class, the tables and desks, the benches would all be kind of dusty by the time students walked into the class. When I was in 8th grade, I would walk, that first day I remember, I walked to the class, and like what I expected, the desk and the chair where I was supposed to sit was very dusty. And there was this young man next to me. I was looking for some kind of a handkerchief or a Kleenex or something to clean this. And he had already cleaned his. So I asked him, I just looked at him, I asked him if I could borrow his handkerchief to wipe off my desk and chair. And the sentence that I made was, "Can I have your handkerchief?" And he said, 1,000 handkerchiefs for you. Not one, but 1,000. So he lent me his handkerchief. And the next day, when I walked into the class, before I asked, he gave me his handkerchief. He says, 1,000 handkerchiefs for you. And after that, he would go one step further. He would sweep my chair and my desk first before he will sweep his. And this young man, who was from a modest family like me, not rich, not powerful, not wealthy, just a poor kid from someplace in Kabul. And he, by God's mercy, he was named so beautifully, Fazl Ahmad. And he demonstrated what his name meant. The humility he showed, the humanity he showed, the friendship he showed to me, I will never forget it. And in a very small way, that was a hizmat. That was a service. Yes, I could have brought my own handkerchief the next day and the following. But like I said, he taught me a lesson that from the 6 years I was in high school, I have the fondest memory of the simplest act of humanity that this young man performed. And I'm still yearning and longing and hoping that someday, I don't know where he is now, but that someday I will meet him and I will see him as the most beautiful example of what a human being is like. It doesn't matter how much you have that you give. What matters is that what you have, how you give it, with how much willingness, with how much sincerity, with how much beauty of the heart that you can manifest to the other person. Mm-hmm. And just to end it, I always, in a teasing manner, called him the young man with 1,000 handkerchiefs. And I'm still missing the man with 1,000 handkerchiefs.
Yeah, this is kind of great message to finish. Thank you so much for your time and for these great insights. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
Ladies and gentlemen, see you at the next program.